CrossFit and Hyrox might use similar movements, but they are completely different sports and therefore demand different training approaches. This became crystal clear to me after testing a CrossFit Games competitor and an Elite 15 Hyrox racer. The results showed that training for years in each sport shaped the body in unique ways. In this video, I will break down the data, explain the key physiological differences, and show you how to train smarter, whether you are into Hyrox or CrossFit. Alright, let's dive into it. Hi everyone, I'm Gomar. I'm a senior scientist at ETH Zurich, based in Switzerland. And for the last decade or so, I studied and taught different aspects of exercise physiology, and now I want to bring some of that science back to you guys. So as I said in the beginning of the video, I had the unique opportunity to test both an Elite 15 Hyrox racer just a couple of weeks ago and also several CrossFit Games athletes. And what do I mean, or how did I test them? I did a typical or a basic endurance test that we always do in the laboratory, in the exercise physiology laboratory, and it's called a step test to exhaustion or a ramp test to exhaustion, where you simply increase the intensity of exercise throughout time until the athlete cannot run, bike, row anymore and he or she is exhausted, right? And we test several aspects, for example, the ventilation, the amount of oxygen that athlete can take up, as well as the lactate. And I will talk mostly about lactate today. So we know a lot about this test in typical endurance athletes like marathoners, cyclists, Ironmans, and so on. But what about functional athletes? That's quite interesting, obviously, because yes, they need some kind of an aerobic base, but they certainly also need a lot of anaerobic power production, as I told you a lot about in my previous videos, certainly in CrossFit. Hyrox, it's a little bit of a different beast, and I will try to explain the physiological differences between mostly Hyrox as well as CrossFit based on the tests I did on those athletes. So we can get to the data. Let's first focus on the Elite 15 Hyrox racer, because that's also mostly fresh in my mind, and I tested him a couple of weeks ago. And here on both axes, you see on the right side, you see the orange line, which is the lactate, all right? And on the x-axis, it's just the speed. We started at 9 kilometers an hour, then always with increments of 1.2 kilometers an hour. Every 4 minutes, we increased the intensity until the athlete could not run anymore. This was approximately around 20 kilometers an hour. So he was completely exhausted, right? And then you also see the green line, which is the heart rate. First of all, heart rate nicely goes up linearly with intensity. That's always what we see, and that's a very typical physiological adaptation. But lactate is a little bit different. You see very nicely here that the athlete has a very good aerobic base. This means that the lactate stays very low at 1.2, 1.3, 2.0 for a very long time. Up until 15 kilometers an hour, this athlete is working predominantly aerobically. So it's always a mix between aerobic and anaerobic systems, but predominantly this is aerobic, and the lactate that is produced by the anaerobic system is, let's say, cancelled out or at least absorbed by his good aerobic system. So, and then after 15 kilometers an hour, you see a slight bump in lactate. This means that there is some kind of a shift, that there is a overproduction of lactate, and you see an increase in lactate in the bloodstream. All right, this is kind of the mixed zone between, let's say, in this case 2.0 until 3.2 millimolars per liter of lactate, and then you see this nice exponential phase, and that's when he's really going into the red and getting exhausted. So that's a typical curve, but I have to say I was quite impressed how long his aerobic base was, and I will get to that in a second, how different this is from a CrossFit athlete. When we go a little bit deeper, we can see, let's say, two physiological thresholds, right? There's many ways to discuss these thresholds, but I always do it as the first, let's say, the aerobic threshold. That's the first bump, as I spoke about in lactate, and you can call this the baseline lactate plus 0.5 millimolar per liter. And for him, this will be around 15 kilometers an hour. So everything before 15 kilometers an hour is basically his zone 2 work. He's just chilling. He can talk still, and he's just working mostly aerobically. And then there's a very short intermediate period. I will get to that in a second. And then at 17 kilometers an hour, 17 kilometers an hour, there is this intersection of the two lines or the two slopes I added there. And that basically shows his most exponential phase of the lactate curve. And this will be around 17 to 17.5 kilometers an hour. That would be his threshold pace. This pace he can hold for 40 to 50 minutes. So 17 kilometers an hour is 330 per kilometer. And interestingly enough, when I asked him how fast approximately do you race on average your kilometer times during a Hyrox, because we know all that Hyrox involves 8 kilometers of running, and he says, yeah, slightly above this, around 3 minutes 40 to 3 minutes 45. That's actually his weakness, and he has to improve this to even get better at Hyrox. But then you can actually appreciate the speeds that these guys are running, right? Like 17 kilometers an hour, 16 kilometers an hour, while also doing all these functional movements. Really an aerobic sport, clearly here. And as I said, you can then show also the different zones indicated by colors, which will be the green zone, all zone 2 and zone 1, and then this intermediate zone, which is very narrow for him. Yeah, is in between those lactates. And then when he goes above 3.5 millimolar of a lactate, he will really get into this exponential phase. He cannot sustain this phase for a very long time and will actually have to decrease his pace quite dramatically. That's also why he cannot push the pace much faster during a Hyrox, because he would just burn out and would, for example, not be able to do the wall balls at the end. So that's a very good curve, like of a well-trained aerobic athlete, typical short or middle yellow zone, and then a long endurance base. Before I go into the physiological profile and the lactate curve of a CrossFit Games, a high-profile CrossFit Games athlete, I just want to take you out of the video real quick and explain our new Masterclass series that we are launching starting already end of November and running through the winter and spring of 2024-2025. So what I always find on social media is that most of the information is very surface level, like the cool clickbait titles and what is interesting for training and so on, but never really a deep dive into a specific topic. And that's why we're launching like a masterclass series, which will be predominantly done online, also a live event in March, where we dive deep into a specific topic about the training, nutrition, and even weight loss. So these masterclasses are, let's say, a combination of theoretical lectures or aspects about this specific topic, but also you will get an assignment at home. That's quite cool, I think, that you have to do, for example, testing an athlete or making a nutritional plan or making a training plan. And that assignment we will then in group discuss. And also you can obviously ask questions about this during the last lecture. If you're interested in learning more about these masterclasses, I highly encourage you to check out our website. It will be also the first link in the description. All right, let's get back into the video now. All right, and then let's also look at a different type of athlete. In this case, a CrossFit Games athlete. So I had the unique opportunity to test a high-profile CrossFit Games athlete. And to give you some background, this athlete is good at both longer events, but also shorter events. And he was also very strong. So it was not a typical pure endurance type, let's say CrossFit Games athlete. He was kind of in between and good at everything, I have to say. So if you look at his curve, I test him on the bike to be more specific. So at very low intensities, also has a very nice base, a typical aerobic base. But then you see his lactate creeping up from 2 to 2.5. You see already this longer creep up and this longer, let's say, middle zone. I will get to that in a second. And then he also speeds up until 13 millimolars per liter of blood. So also very high lactates at the end. And also tested other athletes in the CrossFit space and they even get much higher, right? So how does it look if you again overlay these typical zones, right? The aerobic, the mixed, and basically the lactate producing zone, or at least the zone 5. And you see immediately that this light or the yellow zone where this kind of intermediate lactates are, and there's kind of an overlap or a strong overlap between aerobic and anaerobic metabolism to produce energy is much, much wider. For example, here, I think I even showed it better. On the top, you see the Hyrox athlete, and on the bottom, you see the CrossFit Games athlete, right? So while they also both get quite far into a test, so they both have a high VO2 max, the threshold as a percentage of the VO2 max will be much higher in the Hyrox athlete compared to the CrossFit Games athlete, because obviously the training is much different. I will get to that in a second. So these were two males. If you look at females, for example, I also tested some females related to the CrossFit Games athletes. I haven't been able to test Hyrox athletes in the Elite 15, for example. But you see here a very similar effect. So this is the lactate curve of a high-profile CrossFit athlete. And you see here that there's some aerobic base, but the lactate starts going up quite early, and then she can just hold those middle zones for a very long time and get to a very high lactate. So I tested a couple of women, and you see here that they all get up to 20 millimolars. So that's quite crazy. So how high these lactates are at the end of an exercise test to exhaustion. Usually you see this, for example, in a sprint, in a 1 minute sprint, but not after such an endurance test. So that also means that they have a very high developed anaerobic system, in my opinion. So then we can already jump into, let's say, the more take home, and also giving you some advice on training those specific sports. So if you look at the volume of conditioning, I asked the Hyrox athlete to how much he actually run per week, and we're talking about 50 to 70 kilometers per week of pure, let's say, zone 2 running, but also thresholds or more interval style running, which would for him be around 17 or even up to 18 kilometers an hour for 4 to 5 minutes, right? So that would rather be his running volume, and then obviously interspersed with a lot of, let's say, conditioning volume. Then how does CrossFit Games athletes train? They train obviously differently. They don't do that much zone 2 work or aerobic conditioning, and that's clearly also what is reflected in the lactate curve. They do more this intermediate style workouts where they work at the threshold or at least at high intensities for example, AMRAPs of 12 minutes, 15 minutes, 16 minutes. So physiologically, this is a completely different stimulus, and that's also why they have this wider yellow base. If you look at maximal lactate, right? Like lactate, you have to think about it. It's always, let's say, a combination of what is produced via the anaerobic sources and what is, let's say, consumed by aerobic, mostly type 1 fibers. And obviously someone with a very bad aerobic system and who's doing a lot of high intensity interval style training like a CrossFit athlete, he will obviously have very high lactate very early on. While a Hyrox athlete who has a very good aerobic base cannot produce that much lactate because he or she doesn't really need it. Maybe during the sled push and pull, there's some anaerobic involvement, but basically predominantly a Hyrox, even when it's under an hour, is going to be predominantly aerobic. So obviously the maximal lactate will not be as high. And most Hyrox athletes that I know, but obviously I don't know them all, are using more of a polarized approach where they do a lot of low intensity work because they just have to accumulate a lot of volume and then combine this with higher intensity or even threshold work. While CrossFit athletes, yes, they also do a lot of high intensity work, but that high intensity is basically their race pace. They always work within this 8 to 20 minute time frame, which will be close to their threshold, right? To their, let's say, anaerobic threshold. Sometimes, obviously, there's different events and it's very difficult to generalize CrossFit, but you see that they're more working, let's say, to just make it a bit more visible in this yellow zone. So CrossFit athletes, if they want to get to the next level, I think one of the things they can consider is also including some aerobic work to be able to push this threshold, mostly on the ergs, more to the right. So for example, if you then have a workout where you start with 50 calories on the rower, you don't have to push into this yellow or even red zone from the get-go, and actually can remain a little bit more aerobic, so you have more energy later in the workout. And that's also what I see a lot, and that's how people plateau, certainly in CrossFit. They just always go hard. They don't have any aerobic base, and then after a while there's just a limit on how much energy they can produce. So I think that would be a potential to also try this polarized approach where you train high intensity obviously, but also have a part of your training in the more aerobic zone, where certainly if you have more time and you want to aim for, let's say, semifinals or even games. As you know, we are now doing the Zone 2 project, and we are actually testing this in, let's say, a larger set of people, where we can see if the Zone 2 or as such a more polarized approach can actually be beneficial on the long term for high intensity interval training. Good, that was it from me today. If you have more questions or any comments, just put them down below in the comment section. If you want to learn more on the differences between Hyrox and CrossFit as a sport, not just physiologically, as I explained in this video just right now, but also differences in biomechanics or nutrition, just click the video that is popping up right now. Ciao.